All right, so now we're going to get into the digestive system. And so for this first video, we're just going to kind of do like a little overview, some reminders of the digestive system and functions of the organs and accessory organs, talk about like the GI tract versus the accessory organs, talk about how food gets processed and how it moves through the GI tract. We'll talk about some key anatomy just to remind ourselves, and then look at some reflexes. So if we are talking about the digestive system, sometimes called the gastrointestinal system, right, the whole purpose, the whole point is basically to extract nutrients from the food that we eat. So things like vitamins, minerals, amino acids, carbohydrates, fatty acids, right, all sorts of stuff like that we can utilize as fuel or that we need to build important parts of the body. And so to get these nutrients, we have to break food down all the way down to the molecular level. We have to break things down into very small components. We can do that mechanically or we can do that chemically, and we'll talk about what that means in just a second. And then we have to do all of this before we can ever get any of these nutrients into the body. So we can't bring in anything that's really large, like the overly large macromolecule things. We have to break them down into their individual subunits in order to actually absorb them. And so the organs that help with this general function are going to be the ones that make up the digestive system. They're like, if we're looking at the medical professions that deal with this part of, or like this system, we're looking at like gastroenterology or proctology. So gastroenterology is going to handle like the upper end, and then proctology will handle the lower end. And so we're going to talk about kind of the two divisions of the GI system, or of the digestive system, right? So we have the actual GI tract, right, which is going to have like the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small and large intestine, and the rectum. And then we also have some accessory organs that are going to help out, including salivary glands, the pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. So if we think about the general function of the digestive system, the big thing is to process the food that we eat. Process that meaning we're doing the actual breaking down, right? Whether that be mechanically, which would be like physically mashing things into smaller pieces, right? Or chemically by using things like enzymes and whatnot. And then once we've processed it, we can absorb all of the useful things, the nutrients, and eliminate anything that we don't need, right, that we cannot actually absorb. And we can kind of change the name of food as it travels through. So when we eat it and it's in our mouth and we're actively chewing, we still call it food. After we finished chewing it though, we now call it a bolus, right? So that's like the mushy, mashed up, chewed food that you have before you swallow. Then you swallow it down to the stomach. When it gets to the stomach and starts mixing with gastric juice or the stomach acid, we call it chyme. And then when we get to the small intestines, we still are called chyme until we are absorbed into the lymphatic system, at least for like the lipids and whatnot, and that's where we call it chyle. So we have a few different names depending on where we're at. For the most part, I'll kind of use some of these terms a little bit interchangeably, but you should be able to recognize all of them. And so we're going to talk about the key parts, which would be like the mouth and the salivary glands, the pharynx and esophagus, the liver and gallbladder, the stomach, the pancreas, the small and large intestine, and the rectum and anus. If you'd like to pause here, you totally can. However, we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff as we go through these videos, and so this would be something that you'd want to maybe look back at, or just kind of pause here to get a quick understanding while we get into the details in just a few minutes. All right, now before we get into the actual individual organs, we're going to review the structure of the GI tract, and really we have 4 layers. So the very, very inside, the open space is what we call the lumen, and then just inside that lumen, right, just kind of touching that lumen, is going to be the mucosa, so that's the most inner layer. Down below that, or just past that, is going to be the submucosa, and then the muscularis. And then the very outer part is the serosa. And so the mucosa, this is where we have epithelial tissue, we have the lamina propria, and we have a very small layer of muscle. The submucosa, we can find things like nerves, blood vessels, things of that nature. And then the muscularis, usually we're talking about 2 layers of muscle. There's a circular layer of muscle that wraps around the tubular shape, and longitudinal, which runs the length of the tube. With the exception being the stomach, which has a 3rd layer going at an angle. And then lastly, the serosa, this is going to be a connective tissue layer on the outside. This is where we have the peritoneum. This is where we can connect to things like the mesentery and whatnot to kind of give ourselves some shape to be kind of held in place. So let's go ahead and talk about those components really quickly. And again, I'm going to go through relatively quickly because these are things that should be somewhat review from anatomy. So the mucosa, this is the most inner lining. This is the most inner portion of the GI tract. On the very, very inside, we have the epithelial layer. This is going to be with stratified squamous cells. When we're looking at the mouth, the pharynx, and esophagus, we transition to simple columnar when we get to things like the stomach and intestines. And then in between a lot of these epithelial cells, we have the goblet cells, which can do things like secrete things like mucus. Just inside of that, we have the lamina propria. This is where we have some connective tissue. We have vessels like the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, and we also have mucosal associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT for short, which is basically going to be related to the immune system, and we'll learn more about the MALT later. And then that muscularis mucosae, again, this is that small area, that thinner layer of smooth muscle that is going to help form the local folds. Right, and we need this to create a higher surface area. That higher surface area is going to create more space for us to absorb, right? More surface in contact with the food we've eaten. The layer just beyond that is the submucosa. Again, this has connective tissue to bind the mucosa and muscularis. And like I mentioned on the previous slide, this is where we have things like glands and blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, as well as nerves and whatnot. So things like the submucosal plexus, right, that neuronal network that's part of that enteric nervous system. We then get to the muscularis propria, this is going to be the thicker muscle layer where we have those 2 different muscle layers, one going circular around the tube and the longitudinal section that is going the length of the tube. We find that the muscularis propria is going to be voluntary when we look at like the mouth and the pharynx and part of the esophagus, as well as the external anal sphincter. And this is going to be so that we can choose to chew and swallow, as well as we can choose when to defecate. So we have voluntary control over the initial swallowing process as well as the actual defecation process. And then everywhere in between, right, most of the esophagus and the stomach, the intestine, both small and large, and then the internal anal sphincter, these are going to have involuntary smooth muscle. Right? Again, we have 2 layers for the most part. We have a circular one that goes around and a longitudinal which runs the length, and then with the exception being the stomach, which has a 3rd layer going at an angle, which is what we call an oblique layer. And then because it's muscle, we do still need to have connection to the nervous system, and so we have the Auerbach's plexus. And then lastly, the very outside layer, this is called the serosa in some books. It can also be called the adventitia. If we're using those terms interchangeably here, so if you may see either, and it also means that you're welcome to use either term. Sometimes we also call it the visceral peritoneum. This is going to be that outer covering of connective tissue and whatnot. It is also going to be where we can kind of suspend organs by, right? We can use that connective tissue. We can use it to connect to things like the mesentery to make sure that the gut organs are not just sitting on the bottom of the abdominal cavity, that they're held in place. Now with the nervous system, we have the enteric nervous system, which is kind of like the side that is going to handle things like the muscle contraction, all that. But we also have the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. So that's going to do things like speed things up or slow things down in response to that fight or flight response. So if we think about the parasympathetic nerves that innervate the GI tract, this will, this is part of the rest and digest, which means we're going to increase the secretions and motility. Basically, we're going to ramp things up when it comes to the digestive system. Whereas sympathetic, right, we are going to ramp things down. We're going to slow down secretions. We're going to slow down movement so we can focus on the things that are required for immediate survival in that emergency situation. Now, the enteric nervous system, this is something we've mentioned before, but we really haven't talked about it a lot, simply because we were so focused on like the autonomic and somatic parts. So let's go ahead and talk about the enteric nervous system a little bit. But basically, this is this net-like or mesh-like system of neurons, what we call a plexus, because it's not just a straightforward line. And we can see that here. You see it here in yellow. It's very much like a net or mesh, right? And so this is going to help kind of conduct, it's basically going to help communicate with the gut, the GI tract, independently of the brain and the spinal cord, so that we have some control over the gut without having to really think about it, or even use the spinal cord for that matter. This is going to help with the motility. It also includes help with the segmentation and peristalsis processes, which we'll talk about what those are in just a little bit. So that's where the myenteric or the plexus of Auerbach comes in. And then the submucosal plexus, right, this is going to help with the mucosa. This is going to help with the blood vessels, whether or not they're constricting or not, as well as talking to the secretory cells that may be releasing things like mucus, right? And they can kind of, the submucosal plexus and myenteric plexus can kind of work together somewhat. Now, there are some reflexes that go with the digestive system, right? And that's going in response to some sort of stimulus. So if we are kind of looking at how things are wired, right? Here we have the myenteric plexus, right? We have a motor neuron that will directly innervate right to the longitudinal and circular smooth muscle layers. When it comes to sensory, right, the mucosal epithelial can bring that in, and it'll communicate with both the submucosal plexus and the myenteric, as well as the central nervous system. And then with the myenteric can talk to the submucosal, right, to talk back to the mucosal epithelium, or it can move over here to talk to the muscle. And then we also can just bypass the myenteric with the mucosal epithelium with the sensory neuron up to the submucosal plexus and back down. So we have a couple ways that we're kind of wired up here. Blue are going to be the sensory neurons, purple are the interneurons, and red are the motor neurons. So let's talk about some of those reflexes in a little bit more detail. We have short and long reflexes. The short reflexes, these are going to be sensory receptors in that enteric nervous system plexus that connect to the effectors. So it's short because we're literally just going from these receptors to the enteric nervous system back to the organs, right, in the GI system. So our pathway is really, really short, right? So we see, like, if we're looking at the short one, we have some sort of internal stimulus. We have receptors that pick up on that. We immediately go to the local nerve plexus, so we're going to the enteric nervous system, and then right to the effectors. Whereas long reflexes, this is where we're involving the central nervous system. And so we have like sight, smell, taste, the thought of food, whatever, right? The nervous system processes that, and then we send it down to the enteric, to the effectors. Or we have some sort of internal stimulus, receptors pick on it, we go up to the central nervous system and back down to the enteric, to the effectors, and then we actually have change.